The torchlight struggles against the darkness, casting frantic, dancing shadows across the damp stone walls of the hall. Outside, the wind howls across the North Sea, carrying the salt spray and the promise of a brutal winter. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of smoke, roasting meat, and the metallic tang of fear. A boy, no older than 12, kneels on the cold floor. His tunic, once fine wool, is now torn and stained with mud from the long road. Men surround him, warriors in wolf pelts and chainmail, their faces carved from granite, their eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating fire. They do not see a frightened child. They see a symbol. One of them steps forward, a giant of a man with a battle axe slung across his back. He reaches out, not with a weapon, but with a pair of iron shears. Boy flinches, his hand instinctively flying to his head, to the cascade of golden red hair that falls past his shoulders, the sacred, unshorn hair that marks his bloodline, his right to rule. The warrior speaks, his voice a low rumble that silences the hall. The world has no need for long-haired kings, he growls. Not anymore. The blades of the shears gleam in the firelight as they open, hovering just above the boy's head. In that single, suspended moment, the fate of a dynasty hangs on a lock of hair. To understand why the snip of a shear could echo through 1,000 years of history, we must first grow out the story of the Merovingians, the long-haired kings who rose from the blood-soaked soil of a dying empire to forge a new world. The North Sea does not welcome, it attacks. Its waves are gray fists pounding a bleak, sandy shore. For the people who live along its edge in the lowlands of what will one day be called Flanders and the Rhineland, life is a constant negotiation with hunger, with the cold, and with the men who come from the sea. They call themselves the Salian Franks, the word Salian perhaps meaning salt or sea, and they are a people forged in the crucible of a world that is collapsing around them. Imagine the mouth of the Rhine, a churning chaos of fresh and salt water, where the great river finally gives up its fight and surrenders to the ocean. On its banks, a collection of timber longhouses huddle together, their roofs thatched with reeds, their walls sealed with mud and dung against the wind. Inside one of these halls, a fire burns low in a central pit, the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the roof, but not before stinging the eyes of the men who sit in a circle around it. They are warriors, their faces scarred, their arms thick from the pull of an oar and the swing of an axe. They are drinking a sour ale from a communal horn, passing it from hand to calloused hand. Their chief sits at the head of the hall, a man whose name history will chew up and turn into myth, Merovech. He is a figure who exists in the mist between legend and fact. Some will later claim his mother was raped by a sea monster, a quinator, a beast of the deep, and that from this unholy union a dynasty was born. The Franks themselves will tell this story, not with shame but with pride. For to be born of the sea is to be born of chaos, of untamable power. Merovech, whether man or myth, represents the moment the Salian Franks began to see themselves not as a tribe, but as a people with a destiny. They are foederati now, allies of Rome, granted land on the empire's crumbling frontier in exchange for their service as soldiers. It is a deal with a dying giant. They take Rome's gold, wear Rome's armor, and fight Rome's enemies. But in their longhouses, they whisper a different truth. Rome is the past. They are the future. The man who will turn this whispered truth into a bloody reality is not Merovech, but his grandson. His name is Clovis, and he is 15 years old when he inherits the kingship of one small tribe among many. He is not tall, but he carries himself with a stillness that unnerves men twice his age. His eyes are the pale blue of a winter sky, and his hair, the sacred, unshorn hair of his line, falls in waves of reddish gold past his shoulders. To cut that hair would be to unmake him, to strip him of the sacred power that the Franks believe resides in it. It is a power older than Rome, older than the memory of their ancestors, and Clovis knows its value. He wears it like a crown long before he ever holds a golden one in his hands. His kingdom, if it can be called that, is a patchwork of villages and forest clearings stretching from the coast to the city of Tournai. His people are farmers, herders, and warriors. They worship gods carved in wood and stone, Wadden, who hangs from the world tree for 9 nights to gain wisdom, Donar, whose hammer throws thunder across the sky. They do not read, they do not write, they remember. Their history is sung in mead halls, passed from scop to warrior, each retelling adding a layer of glory to the deeds of their ancestors. Clovis listens to these songs, but his gaze is fixed southward, toward the Roman cities that gleam like jewels on the horizon. He understands something that his fathers did not. The old gods are strong, but the new world will be built not with song, but with stone. The Roman Empire, or what is left of it in Gaul, is a corpse that refuses to fall. The last Roman general in the region, a man named Syagrius, rules a rump state from the city of Soissons. He calls himself a Roman, but his legions are ghosts, his authority a fading echo. To the south, the Visigoths hold sway, Arian Christians who look down on the native Gallo-Roman population. To the east, other Frankish tribes, the Ripuarians, the Chamavi, eye each other with suspicion and ambition. It is a world of fragments, and Clovis looks upon it with the cold, calculating eye of a young wolf surveying a herd of deer, each one separated from the protection of the pack. In 486 AD, he makes his move. He gathers his warriors, not with a written summons, but with the raising of the war axe, the Francisca, a weapon designed to be thrown to bite into an enemy's shield and shatter it. He marches on Soissons. The battle, when it comes, is not the clash of titans that poets will later imagine. It is brutal, close quarters, a meat grinder of men pushing against men, shields splintering, swords finding the gaps between ribs. Syagrius's Roman force, trained in the old ways, fights with discipline, but Clovis fights with fury. He does not command from the rear. He is in the press of bodies, his long hair matted with the blood of his enemies and his own men, his voice a roar that cuts through the din of steel and screams. When the Roman line breaks, it is not a retreat, it is a rout. Syagrius flees, seeking refuge with the Visigoths to the south. Clovis does not pursue. He lets his enemy run, because he knows that the flight of Syagrius is worth more than his death. It sends a message to every warlord, every chieftain, every remnant of Roman power in Gaul. There is a new force here, and its hair is long, and its reach is long. The city of Soissons falls without a further fight. Clovis rides in not as a conqueror, but as a king. He looks at the Roman architecture, the stone basilicas, the paved roads, the aqueducts, and he understands that he is not here to destroy. He is here to inherit, but his warriors do not share his vision. They are men of the longhouse, of plunder and cattle. To them, victory means taking what they can carry. And in the aftermath of Soissons, a moment occurs that will define Clovis's reign, a moment that reveals the iron fist inside the velvet glove of his ambition. The soldiers, as was their custom, loot the city. They strip churches of their silver, homes of their valuable. Among the spoils is a sacred vase, a vessel of incredible craftsmanship, taken from the cathedral. Clovis, already calculating the political cost of alienating the powerful Catholic bishops of Gaul, requests the vase from his men. He frames it as a personal favor. Most of his warriors, understanding the politics of gift-giving and loyalty, agree. But one man, a soldier whose name history will not record but whose stubbornness it will immortalize, refuses. He stands in the assembly of the army, a gathering as old as Frankish tradition, and he raises his axe. He strikes the vase, shattering it. "You shall have nothing here," he declares, "except what the lot gives you." Clovis does not react. He swallows the insult. He smiles. He collects the pieces of the vase and sends them to the bishop, apologizing for his men's lack of discipline. But he remembers. He waits. A year passes, perhaps two. Then, during the annual military review, the moment of reckoning comes. The king walks among his soldiers, inspecting their arms, their armor. He stops before the man who shattered the vase. He looks at the soldier's equipment, finds fault with it, a spear not properly sharpened, a shield strap worn thin. And then, with a calm that is more terrifying than rage, he speaks. He reaches out not with a sword, but with his own Francisca, the throwing axe that is the symbol of Frankish warriorship. He pulls the soldier's own axe from his belt. He examines it. He finds it lacking. And then, with a single, fluid motion, he drives the blade into the man's skull. He lets the body fall to the ground. He looks at the assembled army. "Thus," he says, his voice carrying across the silent field, "did you do to the vase at Soissons." It is not justice. It is not the rule of law. It is the assertion of absolute will. Clovis has just taught his men a lesson they will never forget. His authority is not a matter of consensus, but of survival. He is the king. His word is the only law. And from this moment forward, the Salian Franks are no longer a confederation of warriors. They are the instrument of a single man's ambition. He sets his sights now on the rest of Gaul. He marries Clotilda, a Burgundian princess, a Catholic Christian in a sea of Arian heresy. He does not marry her for love. He marries her for the political alliance it brings, for the connection it gives him to the powerful Catholic network that still weaves its way through the old Roman aristocracy. But Clotilda brings more than an alliance. She brings a faith. She brings a God who, she tells her pagan husband, is the one true God, the God who delivers victory to those who call on him in sincerity. Clovis listens. He does not believe, not yet, but he listens, and he stores the information away like a general storing supplies for a siege he knows is coming. He is still a pagan. His long hair still flows unshorn, a symbol of the old power. But in his mind, he is already seeing a future where that hair is anointed with holy oil, where the power of the old gods and the power of the new church are fused together into a single, unstoppable weapon. He is a young man, barely out of his teens, and yet he is already thinking in the terms of centuries. He is not just a king, he is a dynasty waiting to happen. But the gods of his ancestors are not silent. They have their own claims on his soul, and before he can wear the crown of a Christian king, he must first prove to himself, and to the world, that his own gods are powerless against the one true God. That test is coming. It will come on a battlefield called Tolbiac in the rain, when the world is spinning toward darkness, and a desperate king makes a deal with a god he does not yet understand. The axe of the old gods will clash with the cross of the new, and only one will survive. The long hair of the Merovingian king will be caught in the wind of that collision. What emerges on the other side will be something the world has never seen before. A barbarian king with the blessing of Rome's god, a man who wields the sword and the cross as one. But the path to that moment is paved with blood, with doubt, and with the ghosts of 1,000 warriors who will fall in the rain, their souls claimed by gods who are about to become forgotten. Clovis stands on the threshold of history. The sea from which his ancestors came has receded. The future is a dark forest ahead, full of enemies, full of opportunity. He runs his hand through his long hair, feeling its weight, feeling the power his people believe it holds. And he takes the first step into the trees. The rain falls in sheets, a gray curtain that turns the battlefield of Tolbiac into a quagmire of mud and blood. The year is 496 AD, and Clovis, king of the Salian Franks, is losing. He stands on a low rise, his boots sinking into the churned earth, his long hair, that sacred, unshorn banner of his people, plastered to his skull and shoulders by the downpour. Before him, the Alemanni, a fierce confederation of Germanic tribes from east of the Rhine, presses lines with the relentless fury of a tide. His warriors, the same men who shattered the Roman remnant at Soissons, are being pushed back. Their shield wall is buckling. Men are dying in the mud, their screams swallowed by the drumming of the rain. Clovis has prayed to his gods. He has called on Woden, the All-Father, who sacrificed himself on the world tree for wisdom. He has called on Donar, the Thunderer, whose hammer smashes the skulls of giants. He has made offering. He has promised spoils, but the gods of his ancestors are silent. The rain does not stop. The Alemanni do not break. His own warriors, men who would follow him into the jaws of hell, are beginning to look at him with something he has never seen in their eyes before: doubt. And then in that moment of utter despair, when the weight of his ambition seems about to crush him in the mud of a foreign feet, he remembers her words. Clotilda, his wife, the Burgundian princess who prays in a stone church while he worships under the open sky. She has spoken to him of her God, the God of the Christian, the God who does not live in a sacred grove or a carved idol, but who is everywhere, who sees all, who holds the fate of kings in his hands. She has told him of Christ, who died and rose again, who offers victory not just in battle but over death itself. Clovis has listened politely, as a husband listens to a wife whose world he does not fully share. But now, with the Alemanni howling in his ears and the taste of defeat bitter on his tongue, he does not just listen, he prays. He raises his face to the sky, letting the rain sting his eyes. He does not know the words. He is a pagan, a long-haired king of a people who have never knelt to any god. But he finds the words anyway, words torn from the raw, bleeding center of his soul. "Jesus Christ," he cries, his voice cracking over the din of battle. "You who Clotilda proclaims to be the Son of the living God, who gives aid to the oppressed and victory to those who trust in you, I humbly implore the glory of your aid. If you grant me victory over these enemies, if I experience the power that your people claim to have experienced, I will believe in you, and I will be baptized in your name. I have called on my own gods, but they have abandoned me. I believe they are powerless. I call on you now. I want to believe in you. Just deliver me from my enemies." It is a bargain. It is the bargain of a desperate man, a king who has staked everything on a single roll of the dice. But it is also something more. It is a moment of genuine, terrified faith. In that instant, standing in the rain, Clovis is no longer the calculating strategist who shattered a vase to prove his authority. He is a man who has reached the limit of his own power and found it wanting. He is reaching out into the darkness, hoping that something, anything, will reach back. And then the tide turns. It is not a miracle in the sense of a pillar of fire or a voice from the heavens. It is a miracle of morale, of momentum, of the sudden, inexplicable shift that happens on battlefields when one side decides it will not break. Perhaps the Alemanni see the Frankish king standing tall on his rise, his hair streaming in the rain, and they think he has found some new source of power. Perhaps his own warriors, seeing their king throw himself into the fray with renewed fury, find their own courage rekindled. Whatever the reason, the Alemanni waver. Their shield wall, moments before an unstoppable wall of iron and wood, begins to crack, and then it shatters. They turn, they run, they flee into the darkness of the forest, leaving their king dead on the field, leaving their warriors scattered among the mud, leaving Clovis the victor of Tolbiac. He stands on the field as the rain begins to ease, as the first gray light of dawn breaks through the clouds. He is exhausted, covered in the blood of his enemies and his own men. But he is alive. He has won, and he remembers the bargain he made in the darkness. He does not convert immediately. That is not Clovis's way. He is a man who thinks in terms of power, of leverage. He has called on the Christian God, and that God has delivered. But he is also king of a pagan people. He must bring them with him. He cannot simply abandon the gods of his fathers. He must make them obsolete. So he waits. He returns to his wife, Clotilda, and he tells her what happened. He tells her that her God is powerful. He tells her that he will keep his promise. But he will do it in a way that turns a personal conversion into a national spectacle, a political masterstroke that will bind his people to him, with chains of faith stronger than any oath of loyalty. The baptism, when it comes, is an event designed to shake the foundations of Gaul. Clovis gathers his court, his warriors, and a host of bishops, including the revered Saint Remigius, the Bishop of Reims. The cathedral, or what will become the cathedral, is not yet the soaring Gothic masterpiece of later centuries. It is a simpler structure, a basilica of stone and timber, but to the Franks who have worshipped in forest clearings and longhouses, it is a palace of the divine. The air is thick with incense, a scent none of them have ever known. Candles flicker against the walls, casting long shadows that seem to move with a life of their own. Clovis approaches the baptismal font. He is a king in his prime, his long hair, still unshorn, still sacred, flowing down his back. He wears a white tunic, a symbol of the purity he is about to receive, though the irony of a man whose hands are stained with the blood of his enemies wearing white is not lost on the assembled bishops. They understand what is happening here. They are not just baptizing a barbarian chieftain. They are legitimizing a king. They are forging an alliance that will shape the future of Europe. Saint Remigius speaks. His voice, weathered by decades of preaching to a world in collapse, echoes through the stone hall. He addresses the king directly, his words carefully chosen to guide Clovis into his new identity. "Bow your head, Sicambrian," he says, using the ancient name for the Franks, a name that ties them to the old Roman frontier. "Bow your head, adore what you have burned, burn what you have adored." It is a command. It is an invitation. It is a summary of the entire transformation that is about to take place. Clovis, the pagan king who worshipped trees and thunder, who made offerings to Woden and Donar, is being told to let go of his past. He must burn the idols of his ancestors and adore the god of his wife. He must become something new. He bows his head. The water from the font is cool against his scalp as the bishop pours it over his long hair. The hair that has never been cut, the hair that marks him as a king of the Franks, is now drenched in the water of Christian baptism. It is a fusion of two worlds. The old power, the sacred bloodline that stretches back to Merovech and the sea beast, is being sanctified by the new power, the Church of Rome. Clovis is no longer just a barbarian king. He is now the eldest son of the Church, the first Catholic king of the Franks. He rises from the font, and the water dripping from his hair mingles with the incense in the air, creating a scent that will linger in the memory of all who witness it. But he does not rise alone. Behind him, 3,000 of his warriors, his most loyal followers, step forward to be baptized as well. They do not all understand the theology. They do not grasp the nuances of the Trinity or the debates over Arianism that have torn the Christian world apart. But they understand loyalty. They understand that their king has found a new God, a God who gives victory, and they will follow that God as they have followed their king into 100 battles. The ceremony stretches for hours, the priests working in shifts, the water in the font growing murky with the dust and sweat of 3,000 warriors washing away the old world. In a single day, Clovis has achieved what generations of Roman emperors could not. He has united a Germanic people under the banner of Catholic Christianity. The other Germanic kingdoms of Europe, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, are all Arian Christian, considered heretics by the Catholic mainstream. Clovis now positions himself as the defender of the true faith, a holy warrior whose wars of conquest can be framed as crusades against heresy. It is a masterstroke of political branding. Every sword he draws from this moment forward will be sanctified by the Church. Every territory he conquers will be a gift to God. The consequences of this choice will echo for centuries. The alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the Catholic Church creates a new axis of power in Europe. When the old Roman aristocracy looks at Clovis, they no longer see a barbarian chieftain with long, unkempt hair. They see a king, anointed by God, who rules by divine right. They begin to send their sons to serve in his court, their daughters to marry his nobles. The cultural and political fusion that will become France begins here, in the baptismal waters of Reims. But Clovis is still Clovis. He is still the man who shattered a soldier's skull with an axe to prove his authority. Conversion does not tame his ambition. It only refines it, gives it a higher purpose, a language of justification. In the years after his baptism, he turns his attention to the Visigothic kingdom to the south. They are heretics, he declares. They do not worship the true God. They must be brought to the light by the sword if necessary. He marches into Aquitaine, his long hair now adorned with the symbol of the cross, his warriors fighting under a banner that blends the old pagan symbols with the new Christian faith. The Battle of Vouillé in 507 AD is the culmination of his southern campaign. He meets Alaric II, the Visigothic king, on a field near Poitiers. It is a clash of two worlds, the Catholic Franks against the Arian Visigoths, the new alliance of barbarian might and Roman faith against the older, more established Gothic kingdom. Clovis, now a veteran of 1,000 skirmishes, fights with the fury of a man who believes God fights beside him. The Visigoths break. Alaric II falls, cut down by Clovis's own hand, according to the chronicles. The kingdom of the Visigoths in Gaul collapses, retreating across the Pyrenees into Spain, leaving the Franks as the undisputed masters of what was once Roman Gaul. Clovis returns to his new capital at Paris, a city he has chosen for its strategic position on the Seine, its ability to connect the northern Frankish lands with the newly conquered south. He is now the most powerful king in Western Europe. His realm stretches from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Rhine. The old Roman province of Gaul is now, in all but name, the kingdom of the Franks. And the man who made it possible is a former pagan chieftain with long, unshorn hair, who made a desperate bargain with a foreign god on a rainy battlefield. But even as he reaches the apex of his power, the seeds of his dynasty's destruction are being planted. He is a Merovingian king, and Merovingian kings have a tradition that will prove to be both their strength and their fatal flaw. The kingdom in their tradition is not a unified state to be passed to a single heir. It is a patrimony, a family possession, to be divided equally among all surviving sons. Clovis has 4. And as he grows older, as the shadow of mortality begins to creep across his vision, he knows what is coming. When he dies, his sons will tear his kingdom apart. They will fight over the corpse of his ambition, and the unity he forged through blood and faith will shatter into fragments. He tries to prevent it, perhaps. The sources are silent on his final thoughts. In 511 AD, he dies in Paris, a king who has transformed his world. His body is laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, a building he commissioned, a monument to the God who gave him victory. His long hair is washed, combed, and laid across his chest, a final symbol of the sacred power he carried from birth to death. The Church will later canonize him, not for his piety, but for his political utility. Saint Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, the man who brought the light of Christ to a pagan people. But his sons, Theuderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar, are already sharpening their knives. They stand around his tomb, their own long hair flowing, their own ambitions burning. They have learned from their father. They have learned how to kill, how to scheme, how to turn faith into a weapon. And they look at the kingdom he built, the vast expanse of land stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, and they see not a sacred trust, but a prize to be divided. The unity of Clovis will not survive his funeral pyre. The dynasty he founded will descend into a darkness of its own making, a world of blood feuds, murdered nephews, and queens who wield poison as deftly as their husbands wield swords. The long-haired kings will multiply, each one a fragment of the dream their grandfather realized. And the forces that Clovis so carefully balanced, the church, the aristocracy, the old pagan traditions, will begin to pull the kingdom apart. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, Clovis lies in his tomb, his long hair undisturbed, his legacy a fragile thing waiting to be shattered by the sons who will inherit not just his crown, but his ruthlessness. The cross and the axe, united in his hands, will be torn apart by the hands that reach for them next. And the darkness that Clovis held at bay through sheer force of will descend on his house like a plague. The tomb of Clovis is barely cold before the carving begins. His 4 sons gather not to mourn, but to divide. They meet in a chamber thick with the scent of wax and the heavy brocade of royal vestments. Outside the stone walls, the city of Paris goes about its business, unaware that the unity it has known for a generation is about to be sliced into quarters. Theuderic, the eldest, born of a pagan union before Clovis married Clotilda, claims the eastern lands, the Frankish heartland along the Rhine and the Moselle. Clodomir claims the Loire Valley, the fertile center of the Old Kingdom. Childebert takes Paris itself, the symbolic heart of Clovis's new realm. And Clothar, the youngest, inherits the northern lands, the ancient Salian territories along the coast. They embrace, they swear oaths of brotherhood, they promise to rule together to defend the kingdom their father built. But the promises are dust on the wind. Each king establishes his own capital, his own court, his own army. Each king has his own ambitions, his own advisors, his own vision for the future. The kingdom of Clovis becomes a patchwork of competing sovereignty, a family business run by men who would happily murder each other for a larger share of the inheritance. And murder they do. The first great crime of the Merovingian civil wars is not a battle between armies, but a whisper in a corridor. Clodomir, the king of Orleans, dies on an expedition against the Burgundians in 524 AD. He leaves behind 3 young sons, boys whose long hair marks them as heirs to his kingdom. His brothers, Childebert and Clothar, see an opportunity. The children are obstacle. They must be removed. But Merovingian tradition forbids the killing of a king's sons. The sacred hair cannot be cut. The sacred blood cannot be spilled. Or can it? The brothers send a message to their sister-in-law, Clotilda, not the great Clotilda, the wife of Clovis, but her daughter-in-law, a woman named Gunthuca. They offer to take the boys into their care, to protect them, to raise them as their own. It is a lie wrapped in silk. The mother, suspecting the truth, tries to hide her sons. She sends them away to a trusted servant, hoping to keep them safe. But the betrayal comes from within. The boys are found. They are brought to Childebert and Clothar. The scene that unfolds is one of the most chilling in Merovingian history. The two kings sit in judgment over their nephews. They look at the boys, the oldest perhaps 10, the youngest still a toddler, and they see not children but claimants, rivals, threats to the neat division of their father's kingdom. Childebert, the king of Paris, is said to hesitate. He looks at the boys, at their long, sacred hair, at the fear in their eyes, and he feels the weight of kinship. He pleads with his brother Clothar. "Spare the oldest," he says. "Let the child live, take the tonsure, become a priest, renounce his claim." But Clothar is made of colder stuff. He looks at his nephews with the same calculating eye his father once used to size up a rival. He knows that a Merovingian prince with a head full of hair is a threat, no matter what vows he takes. The hair can grow back. The ambition can be rekindled. There is only one way to be sure. He sends his servant, a man named Archenius, to do what Merovingian tradition forbids. Archenius finds the oldest boy, the one Childebert wanted to spare, hiding in a corner of the hall. The child clings to his uncle's servant, his small fingers grasping at the man's tunic. He does not understand. He cries out for his uncles, the men who should protect him, the men who have sworn oaths to his dead father. Archenius hesitates. He is a Frank, a warrior, a man who has seen death on 100 battlefields. But this is different. This is a child. This is a king's son. He raises his sword, and the boy's screams echo through the stone hall. He kills the child. Then he turns to the second, and then, according to the chroniclers, he finds the youngest, still so small that he cannot yet speak. The toddler hides under a bed, his little hands clutching the fabric, his eyes wide with a terror he cannot name. Archenius pulls him out. The child, sensing his doom, clings to the servant's knees, his mouth opening in a wail that will never be silenced. The sword falls. The third child, the youngest, does not die. He is grabbed by loyal servants, spirited away in the chaos. Hidden in a monastery, he will grow up with his head shaved, his royal claim erased, his long hair a memory. He will live, but he will live as a ghost, a Merovingian prince who is no prince at all, a reminder of what happens to those who stand in the way of their uncle's ambition. Childebert and Clothar divide Clodomer's kingdom between them. They embrace again, their arms stained with the blood of their nephews, and they continue their rule. The Merovingian tradition of dividing the kingdom among all sons has just produced its first great horror, but it will not be the last. The lesson is learned. A Merovingian king is not safe from his own blood. The family is not a sanctuary, it is a battlefield. As the decades pass, the kingdom settles into a pattern of violence punctuated by periods of uneasy peace. The 4 sons of Clovis die off, some in battle, some by disease, one perhaps by poison, and their sons inherit in turn. The kingdom fractures further, splitting into 3 distinct regions: Austrasia in the east, Neustria in the west, and Burgundy in the south. Each region has its own king, its own court, its own ambitions. And each king is surrounded by a nobility that grows bolder with each passing generation, watching the royal family tear itself apart, calculating how to profit from the chaos. It is in this fractured world that 2 women emerge from the shadows of Merovingian politics to dominate the stage. Their names are Fredegund and Brunhilda, and their feud will consume the Frankish kingdoms for over 40 years, turning the family squabbles of the Merovingians into something darker, something more destructive, something that will leave the dynasty permanently weakened. Brunhilda comes first. She is a Visigothic princess, the daughter of a Spanish king, raised in the sophisticated Roman-influenced court of Toledo. She is educated, cultured, beautiful. In 567 AD, she is married to Sigebert I, the king of Austrasia, the eastern realm of the Franks. Her arrival is meant to cement an alliance to bring Visigothic prestige to the Frankish court. She brings with her Roman tastes, a sharp intellect, and a will of iron. Fredegund comes from a very different world. She is a servant, a woman of low birth who enters the household of Childeric I, the king of Neustria and Sigebert's brother. She is ambitious, ruthless, and beautiful in a more immediate, dangerous way. She catches the king's eye. She becomes his mistress. And when Childeric's wife, a woman named Galswintha, who happens to be Brunhilda's sister, is found dead in her bed, strangled, the rumor spreads that Fredegund ordered the murder. Childeric marries his mistress, elevating a servant to the rank of queen. And Brunhilda, mourning her sister, swears eternal enmity against the woman who stole her sibling's life and her throne. The feud that follows is not a war between armies alone. It is a war of poison, of assassination, of betrayal that reaches into the deepest chambers of the Merovingian palaces. Fredegund, the servant who became queen, is a master of the dark arts of medieval politics. She does not fight on battlefield. She fights with whispers, with coins slipped to the right hands, with daggers in the shadows. She tries to have Brunhilda killed. She fails. Brunhilda, for her part, is no passive victim. She rules Austrasia with an intellect that terrifies her enemies, building alliances, codifying law, governing with a Roman precision that seems alien to the chaotic world of Frankish war councils. The war between their husband, Sigebert and Childeric, becomes a proxy for the war between the women. Sigebert, the more successful of the brothers, drives Childeric back, cornering him in Tournai, the old Salian capital. Victory seems certain. Sigebert has his enemy at his mercy, but Fredegund does not accept defeat. She sends assassins, 2 young men with poisoned daggers, into Sigebert's camp. They find him at the moment of his triumph, surrounded by his nobles, and they strike. The king of Austrasia falls, his long hair soaked in blood. His dreams of uniting the Frankish kingdoms ended by a woman's vengeance. Brunhilda is captured, humiliated, paraded before her enemy, but she does not break. She is sent into exile, stripped of her power but not of her will. She waits. She plots. She returns. For the next 30 years, she and Fredegund will wage their war across the battlefields of Gaul, each one seeking the final, decisive blow that will end the other's line forever. Fredegund dies in 597 AD, her body finally giving out after decades of intrigue and childbirth. But Brunhilda lives on, now an old woman, her hair white with age, her eyes still sharp, her mind still calculating. She rules Austrasia as regent for her great-grandson, a boy king named Sigebert II. She is the power behind the throne, the last great Merovingian queen, a woman who has outlived her enemies, who has seen the sons of her enemies fall, who has rebuilt her kingdom from the ashes of her own destruction. But the nobility of Austrasia has grown tired of her. They are tired of a woman who rules with an iron fist, who brooks no opposition, who has held power for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to rule themselves. They turn to the one force in the kingdom that can challenge her, the mayors of the palace, the royal stewards who have been growing in power while the Merovingian kings tear each other apart. In 613 AD, the nobles rise against Brunhilda. They call on Clothar II, the king of Neustria, Fredegund's son, to march against her. The old queen, now in her 70s, is captured. Her enemies do not show her mercy. They drag her before a military tribunal. They accuse her of everything: the death of 10 kings, the destruction of the nobility, the corruption of the kingdom. It is a show trial, a pretext for the final act of vengeance. The punishment they devise is meant to erase her from memory. They tie her to the tail of a wild horse. They drive the horse through the camp. Her body is torn apart, her bones shattered, her flesh scattered. The woman who had been a princess of Spain, a queen of the Franks, the mother of kings, the architect of a dynasty, is reduced to a smear on the ground. And in the horrified silence that follows, Clothar II, the son of Fredegund, the grandson of the servant who became a queen, seizes control of all the Frankish kingdoms. For the first time since the death of Clovis, a single Merovingian king rules a united realm. But the unity is an illusion. The decades of civil war, of assassinations, of queens who wielded poison and daggers as weapons of state, have hollowed out the Merovingian monarchy. The nobility has tasted power. The mayors of the palace have learned that they can make and unmake kings. The Merovingian kings who follow Clothar II will be remembered not for their deeds, but for their hair. They will be the rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings, figures who wear the crown but wield no power. Their long hair a symbol of a dynasty that has forgotten how to rule. The great-grandsons of Clovis will ride through their kingdoms in ox carts, their sacred locks flowing, their titles intact, but their authority a ghost. The real power will belong to the men who stand behind them, the mayors who hold the swords, the bishops who hold the keys to heaven, the nobles who hold the land. And in the shadows, a new dynasty is waiting, a family of warriors called the Carolingians, who will watch the long-haired kings fade into irrelevance, waiting for the moment when they can finally reach out and snip the thread of Merovingian history. The blood of Clovis, spilled on 1,000 battlefields, poisoned in 100 chambers, scattered by the hooves of a horse, is running thin. The dynasty that rose from the sea, that conquered Gaul with the cross and the axe, that ruled for 2 centuries through blood and faith, is entering its twilight. And in the halls of power, the whispers are growing louder. What is a king without power? What is a sacred hair when the hand that cuts it holds the real authority? The Merovingians have become symbols, and symbols, no matter how sacred, can be broken. The ox cart lurches over the rutted road, its wooden wheels groaning under the weight of its royal passenger. The king sits on a makeshift throne, a rough-hewn chair draped in faded purple cloth, his long hair, still unshorn, still sacred, falling in thick golden ropes over his shoulders. He wears a diadem of gold, a gift from a long-dead emperor, but his tunic is plain wool, his boots are scuffed, and his hands, folded in his lap, are soft. He does not hold a scepter, he does not carry a sword. The sword, like the power, belongs to the man who walks beside the cart, a barrel-chested warrior with a heavy brow and eyes that never stop moving, the mayor of the palace. This is the image of the later Merovingian kings, the rois fainéants, a term later chroniclers will coin to describe them. Fainéant, do nothing. It is a label that has stuck, a judgment passed down through centuries, painting the last Merovingians as lazy, incompetent, decadent figures who let their kingdom rot while they lounged in palaces and watched their power drain away. But the truth is more complex and more tragic. These kings were not lazy. They were prisoners, trapped in a system their ancestors created, bound by traditions that once made them powerful but now made them obsolete. The rise of the mayors of the palace is not a sudden coup. It is a slow, almost imperceptible transfer of authority, a process that takes over a century complete. The office of the mayor begins simply enough. In the early Merovingian courts, the mayor is exactly what the name suggests: the manager of the royal household, the man who ensures the king's halls are provisioned, his servants are paid, his guests are fed. It is a position of trust, but not of power. But as the Merovingian kings devote more of their energy to fighting each other, as the civil wars of the 6th century consume the dynasty's attention, the mayors begin to accumulate responsibility. They lead armies when the king is busy elsewhere. They negotiate with nobles when the king is distracted by a rival brother. They administer justice when the king is on campaign. By the time Clothar II reunites the Frankish kingdoms in 613 AD, the mayors have become something more than household managers. They have become the real power in the land, the men who hold the levers of government while the kings hold only the titles. Clothar II recognizes this reality. He issues an edict in 614 AD, the Edict of Paris, which attempts to formalize the relationship between the crown and the nobility. It is a compromise, a recognition that the old days of absolute Merovingian authority are over. The king agrees to appoint nobles only from the regions they govern, a concession that strengthens the local aristocracy at the expense of royal power. It is the beginning of a long, slow surrender. The kings who follow Clothar II are not fools. They know their power is slipping, but they are trapped. The Merovingian tradition of dividing the kingdom among all sons has created a system where no single king can ever consolidate enough authority to challenge the nobility. The sacredness of the royal bloodline, once a source of power, has become a cage. A Merovingian king cannot be removed. His hair cannot be cut. His person is inviolable, but he can be ignored. He can be bypassed. He can be wheeled out for ceremonial occasions, his long hair combed and his robes arranged, and then wheeled back into his palace while the real business of governance happens in the chambers of the mayor. It is in the eastern kingdom of Austrasia that the mayors first begin to dream of something more than stewardship. A family rises to prominence in the region, a clan of warriors from the Ardennes forest. Their name is Pippinid, later Carolingian, and their ambition knows no bounds. The first great figure of this family is Pippin of Landen, a mayor who serves King Dagobert I, one of the last Merovingian kings to wield any real authority. Pippin is a master of political maneuvering, a man who understands that the path to power lies not in challenging the king directly, but in making himself indispensable. He builds alliances, he secures land, he marries his children into the most powerful families of the nobility. When Dagobert dies in 639 AD, the Merovingian monarchy begins its final decline, and the Pippinids are waiting to catch it. The decades that follow are a time of shadow kings and warrior mayors. The Merovingian throne is occupied by a succession of men who take the crown as children, live as prisoners, and die as footnotes. Their names blur together: Clovis II, Clothar III, Childeric II, Theuderic III. Each one is placed on the throne by the mayor who controls him. Each one is shuffled aside when a new mayor rises to power. Their long hair, still uncut, still sacred, becomes a taunt, a reminder of a dynasty that once ruled the West and now cannot rule its own household. The man who finally breaks the pattern is Charles Martel, the illegitimate son of Pippin of Herstow, the most powerful mayor of his generation. Charles is not a king. He is not even legitimate in the eyes of the church. But he is a warrior of terrifying skill, a man who understands that in a world of collapsing Merovingian authority, the only power that matters is the power to fight. And fight he does. In 732 AD, an army of Umayyad Muslims crosses the Pyrenees into Gaul, sweeping through Aquitaine, burning churches, looting cities, threatening the very heart of the Frankish kingdom. The Merovingian king, Theuderic IV, sits in his palace, his long hair combed, his hands idle. It is Charles Martel who raises the army. It is Charles Martel who marches south. It is Charles Martel who meets the Umayyad forces near the city of Tours, on a plain between the Loire and the Vienne rivers. The Battle of Tours is not the clash of civilizations that later historians will mythologize, but it is a decisive moment. Charles deploys his forces in a square, a wall of infantry that the Umayyad cavalry charges again and again, breaking against the Frankish shield wall like waves against a cliff. For 7 days, the armies skirmish. On the 7th, Charles launches a counterattack that shatters the Umayyad lines. Their leader, Abd al-Rahman, is killed. The Muslim army retreats, never again to threaten Gaul with such force. Charles returns from the battle with a new name, Martel the Hammer. He has saved the Frankish kingdom. He has saved Christendom, but he has not saved the Merovingians. The king who sat idle while Charles fought is now more irrelevant than ever. The hammer has proven where the real power lies. The Merovingian dynasty, already fading, now seems a ghost, a relic of a past that has no place in the new world Charles is building. But still, the Merovingians hold the throne. The sacred hair, the ancient bloodline, the traditions that go back to Merovech and the sea beast, these things still carry weight. Charles Martel is a warrior, not a king. He cannot simply seize the throne. The Merovingian myth is too powerful, too deeply embedded in the Frankish imagination. So he rules as mayor, as his father ruled, as his grandfather ruled, the power behind the throne, the man who holds the sword while the king holds the title. When Charles dies in 741 AD, his sons, Pippin and Carloman, inherit his power. They are the heirs of the hammer, the scions of a family that has ruled the Franks for 3 generations. But they are still mayors. The Merovingian throne is still occupied, now by a king named Childeric III, the last of his line. Childeric is not a fool. He knows his position. He knows the history. He has seen his predecessors paraded through the kingdom in ox carts, their long hair flowing, their power a memory. He has seen the mayors make and unmake kings with the flick of a wrist, and he waits, as his ancestors have waited, for the end. Pippin, the younger of Charles Martel's sons, is not content to wait. He is ambitious in a way his father was not. He wants the crown. He wants the title. He wants to be king, not just the power behind the throne. But the Merovingian tradition stands in his way. The sacred bloodline cannot be broken. The long hair of the Merovingian kings is more than a symbol. It is a sacred trust, a covenant between the dynasty and the Frankish people. To cut that hair is to sever a bond that has held the kingdom together for 2 centuries. Pippin understands that he cannot simply seize the throne. He must be invited. He must be legitimized. He must find a power greater than Frankish tradition to sanction his ambition. And so he turns to the one institution in Europe that claims authority over kings, the church. In 750 AD, Pippin sends an embassy to Pope Zachary, a bishop facing his own crisis. The Pope is threatened by the Lombards in Italy, desperate for a powerful ally. Pippin offers an alliance. In return, he asks a question: who should be king? The man with the title or the man with the power? Pope Zachary, understanding the opportunity, gives the answer Pippin wants to hear. Better, he declares, that the man who holds the power should also hold the title. The Merovingian kings, he says, have no real authority. They are not true kings. They are only kings in name. It is a revolutionary statement. The Pope, the vicar of Christ, the successor to Saint Peter, has declared that the Merovingian dynasty is illegitimate. The sacred bloodline, the long hair, the traditions that go back to the sea beast, all of it is swept aside by a single papal pronouncement. Pippin has what he needs. The church has given him permission to take the throne. But the Merovingian tradition is not so easily dismissed. The Frankish nobles, the warriors who have served the long-haired kings for generations, must be convinced. Pippin calls an assembly of the Frankish people, a gathering of the great and powerful, to ratify what the Pope has declared. The nobles, many of them loyal to the Merovingian name, must choose between tradition and power. They choose power. They choose Pippin. The last act of the Merovingian dynasty is not a battle. It is a capture. Pippin sends his men to seize Childeric III. The last Merovingian king is taken from his palace, his long hair still flowing, his crown still on his head, but his kingdom already gone. He is brought before Pippin's assembly, a captive king in the presence of the man who will replace him. And there, in front of the nobles who have sworn oaths to his family for generations, the final humiliation is performed. The shears come out. They are not the shears of a barber or a servant. They are the shears of a new king, a man who is about to become something the Merovingians never were, an anointed monarch crowned by the church, blessed by the Pope. The man who holds the shears reaches for Childeric's hair. The golden red locks, the sacred hair that has never been cut, the symbol of 2 centuries of Merovingian rule, falls to the ground. Childeric III is not killed. He is not tortured. He is simply erased. His hair is cut, his royal identity stripped away. He is bundled into a monastery, his head shaved, his name forgotten. He will live out his days in obscurity, a former king who is now just a monk, his long hair a memory, his dynasty a closed chapter. He will die and no one will mark his passing. The Merovingian line, which began in the mist of legend with a sea beast and a king's ambition, ends in the silence of a monastic cell. Pippin is crowned. The church anoints him with holy oil, a ritual that will become the template for 1,000 years of European monarchy. He is no longer the mayor. He is the king of the Franks. He is the founder of a new dynasty, the Carolingians, who will take the inheritance of the Merovingians and expand it into an empire that will dwarf anything Clovis could have imagined. His son, Charlemagne, will be crowned emperor of the Romans, the greatest king in Europe since the fall of Rome. But the Merovingians do not simply vanish. They do not fade into irrelevance. Their blood, their traditions, their sacred kingship, these things persist. The idea of the long-haired king, the king who is chosen not by men but by blood, the king who carries the sacred power of his ancestors in his very hair, this idea is too powerful to die. It will echo through the centuries, shaping the myths of the Middle Ages, fueling the legends of the Holy Grail, inspiring the kings who come after to claim a connection to the Merovingian line. The last shear has been made. The long-haired kings are no more. But in the silence that follows the fall of their hair, a new story begins. The Merovingian legacy, the legacy of Clovis and Clotilda, of Fredegund and Brunhilda, of a dynasty that rose from the sea and conquered a kingdom, does not end in a monastery. It transforms. It becomes something else. It becomes the foundation upon which the nations of France and Germany will be built. It becomes the ghost that haunts the kings of Europe, a reminder of what a king should be, what a king should look like, what a king should carry in his blood. The long hair is cut, but the memory remains. The stone walls of the monastery rise from the winter landscape, gray against a gray sky. Inside, a man walks a cold corridor, his feet bare against the flagstones, his head bowed. His name is Childeric, and he was once a king. He wears the coarse wool robe of a monk, his hands roughened by labor, his face lined by years that have passed in silence. His head is shaved, a smooth, pale dome that catches the thin light filtering through a high window. There is no hair, no sacred, unshorn locks, no crown. He is Childeric, no longer the third, no longer king of the Franks, no longer a Merovingian. He is just a man who once had a name and a dynasty and a destiny. He stops at a window, looks out at the bare trees, the frozen ground, the sky that stretches toward a horizon he will never see again. He does not rage. He does not weep. He has done all of that in the first days after the shears, when the cold metal touched his scalp and he felt the power drain from his body. He has done it in the nights when he woke reaching for a crown that was no longer there. Now, there is only the silence, the routine of prayer and labor, the slow erosion of memory. But he does remember. He remembers the day they came for him, the men of Pippin, their faces hard, their hands rough as they pulled him from his hall. He remembers the journey, the jolting cart, the faces of his people watching from the roadside, their eyes filled with a grief they could not express. He remembers the assembly, the sea of warriors and bishops and nobles, all of them waiting to see what would become of the last Merovingian king. And he remembers the shears. The shears were not special. They were simple iron, the kind a shepherd might use on his flock. But in the hands of Pippin's man, they became something else. They became the end of a world. They opened, they closed, and his hair, the hair of his father and his father's father, going back through the generations to Merovech and the sea, fell to the ground. It lay there on the stones, a pile of golden red strands glinting in the torchlight, and he watched it fall with the same numbness he imagines a tree must feel when the axe bites into its trunk. The fall is silent. The death is slow. He does not know what happened to the hair. Perhaps it was swept away, burned, forgotten. Perhaps someone kept a lock, a relic of the fallen dynasty. It does not matter. What matters is that it is gone, and without it he is nothing. The Merovingian kings were not kings because they held power. They were kings because of the hair. The hair was the sign, the symbol, the sacred marker that set them apart from other men. Without it, they were just men. Without it, Childeric was just a man, and a man could be locked away, forgotten, allowed to die in obscurity. He turns from the window. His knees ache. His back aches. He is not old, not by the measure of years, but he feels ancient. He feels the weight of 2 centuries pressing down on him, the weight of Clovis and Clotilda, of Fredegund and Brunhilda, of all the long-haired kings who came before him. He is the last of them, the final link in a chain that stretches back to a time before memory, and he is alone. He walks to the chapel, where the monks are gathering for the evening prayers. The candles are lit, their flames flickering against the stone. The abbot, a man with a kind face and steady hands, leads them in the psalms. Childeric mouths the words, but his mind is elsewhere. He is thinking of Clovis, his ancestor, standing in the rain at Tolbiac, calling on a god he did not yet believe in. He is thinking of the baptism at Reims, the 3,000 warriors plunging into the water, the long hair of the king dripping with holy oil. He is thinking of the vase at Soissons, the soldier's skull caved in by an axe, the lesson that a king's word is the only law. He is thinking of the brothers, the sons of Clovis, dividing the kingdom like butchers dividing a carcass. He is thinking of the nephew, the boys whose heads were shorn by their uncles' swords, their blood mixing with the dust of a palace floor. He is thinking of Fredegund and Brunhilda, the queens who turned the Frankish kingdoms into a battlefield of poison and steel. He is thinking of all the blood, all the ambition, all the glory, all of it flowing down through the centuries to this moment, to a cold chapel in a forgotten monastery, to a man with a shaved head and no crown. The psalms end. The monks file out, their shadows long on the walls. Childeric lingers, kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped. He does not pray. He does not know what to pray for. He has lost everything. His kingdom, his title, his hair, his identity. The god of Clovis, the god who gave victory at Tolbiac, has not given him victory. The god who anointed the Merovingian kings has abandoned him, or perhaps he has not abandoned him. Perhaps he has simply moved on, to Pippin, to the new dynasty, to the Carolingians who will build an empire on the ruins of his family's legacy. He rises. He walks to the door of the chapel, pauses, looks back at the altar, at the candle flame still burning. He will die here, he knows. He will die in this monastery, his name forgotten, his dynasty a footnote in the chronicles of the Franks. The Merovingians will become a memory, a story told by monks in scriptoriums, a legend whispered by bards in halls. They will become the stuff of myth, the long-haired kings who rose from the sea and ruled a kingdom, who carried the sacred blood of their ancestors in their veins, who were brought down not by enemies but by their own traditions, by the very sacredness that made them kings. He steps out into the corridor, into the darkness. The monastery is quiet now, the monks in their cells, the world outside sleeping under a winter sky. He walks to his cell, a small room with a narrow bed and a crucifix on the wall. He lies down, pulls the rough blanket over his thin body, closes his eyes, and in the darkness he feels it, the ghost of the hair, the phantom weight of the locks that once fell past his shoulders, the memory of the sacred power that once flowed through. It is not there. It will never be there again, but he remembers it, and as long as he remembers, the Merovingians are not quite gone. He sleeps, and while he sleeps, the world turns. In the palaces of the Franks, Pippin builds his new kingdom, anointing his sons, consolidating his power, laying the foundations for an empire. In Rome, the Pope looks north, seeing in the Carolingians a protector, a champion of the faith. In the monasteries of Gaul, monks copy the chronicle, recording the deeds of the long-haired kings, preserving their memory for a future that will need them. The Merovingians are dead, but their story is not. It is being written and rewritten, and will be written again for 1,000 years, for 2,000 years, for as long as men remember what it means to be a king. The morning comes. Childeric wakes to the sound of bells, the call to prayer. He rises, washes his face in a basin of cold water, pulls on his robe. He walks to the chapel, joins the monks in their chanting, their voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythms of the liturgy. He is one of them now. He is no longer a king. He is a brother, a servant, a man who has let go of the world. But in the back of his mind, in the deepest recesses of his memory, he still carries the weight of the hair. He still carries the blood of Merovech. He still carries the legacy of a dynasty that shaped the world, that forged a kingdom from the fragments of an empire, that gave Europe its first Christian kings. He will carry it to his grave. And when he dies, when his body is lowered into the cold ground, when his name is spoken for the last time by the monks who bury him, the Merovingian dynasty will end. But it will not die. It will live on in the myths that grow up around it, in the legends that will claim the Merovingians carried the blood of Christ, that they were the guardians of the Holy Grail, that they will one day return to reclaim their throne. It will live on in the kings who come after, who will claim descent from the long-haired kings, who will wear their crowns and carry their swords and speak their names as a blessing. Charlemagne, the greatest of the Carolingians, will study the Merovingian legacy. He will model his court on theirs, his laws on theirs, his kingship on theirs. He will carry their blood in his veins, for his mother, Bertrada, was a Merovingian princess, a descendant of the long-haired kings. The dynasty that Pippin supplanted will flow through the veins of the dynasty that replaced it. The Merovingians will not be erased. They will be absorbed, transformed, made into something new. And the hair, the sacred, unshorn hair of the Merovingian kings, it will become a symbol, a legend, a thing of power that transcends its physical existence. It will be the hair of kings, the hair that marks the sacred bloodline, the hair that can never be cut without breaking the covenant between the dynasty and the divine. When the last shear falls on Childeric's head, it does not end the power of the hair. It transforms it. The hair becomes memory. And memory, as the Merovingians knew, is more powerful than any crown. The stone walls of the monastery crumble over time, as all stone crumbles. The bones of Childeric turn to dust, as all bones turn to dust. The dynasty that built an empire, that ruled for 200 years, that gave Europe its first Christian kings, fades into the mist of legend. But the story does not fade. It grows. It expands. It takes on new shapes, new meanings, new truths that have nothing to do with the facts recorded in the chronicles and everything to do with the power of myth. The Merovingians become the Fisher Kings, the guardians of the Grail, the descendants of Christ. They become the hidden kings, the secret dynasty, the bloodline that will one day rise again to claim its throne. They become the subject of books and movies and conspiracy theories, a fascination that stretches across the centuries, a reminder that some stories are too powerful to die. But the truth of the Merovingians, the real truth, is simpler and more profound. They were men and women who lived in a world of violence and faith, who built a kingdom from the ruins of an empire, who carried the sacred blood of their ancestors in their veins and the sacred hair of their kingship on their heads. They were flawed, ambitious, cruel, brilliant, doomed. They were the long-haired kings, the kings of the salt-whipped throne, the dynasty that rose from the sea and conquered a continent. And in the end, they did not die. They became the foundation upon which a new world was built. They became the ancestors of every king who would rule in France, in Germany, in the lands that once were Gaul. They became the first chapter in the long, bloody, glorious story of Europe. They were the Merovingians, and their hair was long, and their legacy is forever.